If you ask me right now how many numbers I can remember, the bigger issue lies in the number I remember of my father. It's one he doesn't use anymore.
We're talking about the difference between what we were able to remember just 10 or 15 years ago and what we're able to remember now. Somewhere along the path of technological progress, we've started to forget things. Try to recall more than 2 phone numbers. And I can almost guarantee you that the majority of you will not be able to do this. 70% of people in 2015 knew actually only 2 phone numbers, right? Only 4 years later, in 2019, that number dropped to 60%, right? That's a 10% sharp drop. And it might not seem like too much, but that's only 4 years. Since then, it's been 6 years, right? Imagine how much further that number has dropped.
Daniel, this issue is getting quite alarming. And the way you presented it, I feel like we're at a point of no return. Is this solution? One of the modern day issues that our society faces is digital amnesia. Many people might not have heard of it, so I'm just going to give a really practical example.
Okay.
If you ask me right now how many numbers I can remember, phone numbers, I'll say myself, my mother, and my father's. The bigger issue lies in the number I remember of my father. It's one he doesn't use anymore. So, Daniel, tell us, what is digital amnesia and then how does it affect us?
Right. So first of all, you're not the only one who's affected with this. We are all suffering from this ailment right now. I mean, personally as well, I've struggled to remember more than 1 or 2 phone numbers, and that wasn't always the case, And I'm sure lots of our viewers and listeners will probably testify as well that they are in the same boat here. And this is a huge issue, actually, that we need to give attention to, which we might not be giving as much attention to that we ought to be giving. And that's why I actually wrote this article on digital amnesia, which was published on Hakam. The thing is, to look at the issue, we have to understand that I'm not talking about just, the difference between us and a previous culture, like the pre-Islamic Arabs who had a gift of memorization. They were known for remembering things very well, and a lot of things as well, right? And not forgetting it, right? We're not talking about that, the difference between our civilization and them. We're talking about the difference between what we were able to remember just 10 or 15 years ago and what we're able to remember now, right? We're just comparing ourselves at the moment and that huge cognitive loss and inability that we've developed over this time. Somewhere along the path of technological progress, we've started to forget things, right? And if you ask anyone around, I mean, this is a question out to our listeners and viewers at the moment. Try to recall more than 2 phone numbers. And I can almost guarantee you that the majority of you will not be able to do this, right? And that's the problem that we need to address right now. According to statistics, 70% of people in 2015 knew actually only 2 phone numbers, right? Only 4 years later, in 2019, that number dropped to 60%, right? That's a 10% sharp drop. And it might not seem like too much, but that's only 4 years. Since then, it's been 6 years, right? Imagine how much further that number has dropped.
So, we've spoken about how digital amnesia is working in our society, the issues it's causing, and it's quite recent. So, when did this issue occur?
Right. In order to understand this issue, we need to actually go a lot further back in our history. And from a theological perspective, we will look at the beginning of human civilization. From a theological perspective, we have Adam and Eve, and they're both roaming around in the Garden of Eden, however you want to interpret that, right? And God makes a covenant with the 2 of them. And Adam, alayhi salam, he was a very righteous and pious servant of God. He was the father of all humans, right? But that's the whole point. He was also a human. And like us, he was also forgetful. He forgot that command of God Almighty, right? But he took responsibility for his sudden lapse, right? And he made amends with the Almighty. And he was only able to do this because, as God Almighty described him in the Holy Quran, and I quote, "We found in him no determination to disobey."
So forgetting is not a sin.
Forgetting in itself is not the sin here. It's inherently not a sin, right? I mean, obviously it depends on the nature of the matter and the intentions behind it, right? But humans are forgetful, and that's a fact. But in our case, what we're discussing right now is that, forgetting phone numbers and these kind of things, which they themselves, then it's not a crime, it's not a sin either, right? But if you look at the issue in depth, right, you'll see that it's actually quite alarming. It's not that we are forgetting things more easily. It's the fact that we're not even able to retain information and remember it in the first place anymore, right? It's the same with those phone numbers. Like, we might remember our own phone number because we've strained really hard to remember that phone number. But I mean, try to remember 5 more phone numbers of the people around you right now, and I can almost guarantee you it will be impossible. And that inability is because of those digital advancements, that smartphone in our pocket right now, because we outsource that task of remembering things, right, to our smartphone. In that way, our brains are becoming a bit weaker in that our cognitive ability is becoming weaker, right, in that sense. And this is known in the scientific community as cognitive offloading, right? And that's the result of that, is which has been coined as the term digital amnesia.
So in recent times, we have this spectacular technological advancement known as AI.
Yeah.
How does that affect our cognitive abilities?
Yeah, so AI, I mean, there's lots of studies on this already, and they've been published. AI definitely has an effect on our cognitive abilities, because we are outsourcing essentially a lot of our, not just, asking it to help us with stuff, but we're actually outsourcing our critical thinking, our capabilities of critically analyzing things.
Mm-hmm.
We're asking it to think for us, right? And that is obviously an issue, which is exasperating the issue of our already current state of forgetfulness. Smartphones and the internet has already caused us to be forgetful already. Generative AI is making it all worse. Now, one way of looking at this is if we draw a comparison, a parallel, right? We look at generative AI and we look at our brains, right? They're two very similar machines, because the more information you input into generative AI, right, the more you ask it to think, the more it improves, right? And the same applies to the brain. The more you use your brain to think, the more you put strain on it, the more information you put into it, the sharper it becomes, essentially. The sharper your mind becomes. But the opposite is also true. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? And this lose it part, that's the shocking part. This is a result of hippocampal inactivity, according to science, when we're relying on external storage, essentially. And this is what leads to what a Columbia University neuroscientist actually coined the Google effect, right? Where we remember where to find information, but we don't remember the information itself, right? That's an issue right now.
Interesting that you mentioned Googling. I feel like I Google everything.
Yeah.
I mean, you message me now, and in about 5 months, I'm going to forget that message. And instead of trying to remember, I'm just going to sort of Google my chat and relocate it.
Yeah.
Is there such a big flaw? And because human, as like naturally to us, we do forget things.
Yes, we do. So forgetting is not a sin, it's not a crime, as mentioned before. It's a minor flaw in the sense that obviously it can, cause us some issues or whatever, but it's not a flaw in and of itself. Let's look at the Holy Quran, actually. It explains this in a perfect way. We have the story of Musa alayhi salam and Khizr, right? The Prophet Moses and Khizr. Now, Musa alayhi salam, he was actually traveling with a companion, right? And whilst they were traveling, the companion remembered that he forgot a fish that he was supposed to bring with them. And this meant that they had to actually alter their entire journey, right? But what happened was that in result of that, they actually ended up reaching their true destination that God wanted them, that God intended for them to reach, right? So in that case, forgetting was actually a benefit, right? It wasn't a flaw, right? But what we're talking about right now, digital amnesia, it's the rate of forgetfulness. The science behind that is alarming. Relying on devices, it causes the prefrontal cortex to reduce its effort, right? You're essentially using your brain less, right? And the brain is a muscle. Like any other muscle, the less you use it, the weaker it becomes, right? And what's happening is that this is starting to lead to memory decay, right? And that doesn't only contribute to forgetfulness, it actually also contributes to anxiety, which is a major issue in this modern era anyway. I mean, I'll give you an example of what kind of anxiety we're talking about here. I'm sure that you've, at some point in your life, probably very recently, at night, brushed your teeth, switched off all the lights, gone to bed, ready to sleep. And all of a sudden you remember, hold on a second. Did I turn off the stove? Or did I close the fridge? Right? Or you've gone out with your family and you're enjoying a day out, and then you remember you're 1 or 2 hours away and you remember to think, right? Because you're not actually remembering, did I lock the door? right? When I left home, right? I'm sure we've all been in the same boat here. That's the type of anxiety I'm talking about. That anxiety is caused by forgetfulness in the first place.
So I'm sort of getting the full picture here now. And what I see is this domino effect. And before we do that, let's go back to anxiety. You mentioned anxiety.
Yeah.
How does that come in play?
So anxiety is a state where we are constantly worrying about the future, right? And what does that mean? That means that we are not naturally present at the moment, right? It's a lack of presence. And how do we employ those habits of presence that we should be employing to avoid that anxiety? We need to be present, right? That's the whole point, right? Anxiety is obviously the antithesis of that. As I mentioned, we just constantly worry about the future. In this way, it no longer remains an issue of forgetting phone numbers, right? Because it's causing that kind of anxiety, right? The Quran actually warns us against the results of such forgetfulness. It actually states that those who have forgotten Allah, Allah causes them to forget their souls. And it depends on what kind of interpretation you're looking at or angle you're looking at this verse from. But from one angle, you can see this as being, anxiety, depression, all of these problems right now. How do we forget our soul? We've actually forgotten because we're not present. That's the whole issue, right? That's the crux of the matter. We are not present. And that's why we're just constantly worrying about other things. And that's that domino effect. It's not just forgetting anymore. There's so many offshoots to it.
Daniel, this issue is getting quite alarming. And the way you presented it, I feel like we're at a point of no return. Is this solution?
Actually, there is a solution. I mean, you'll be happy to hear. The solution, this is one of those matters where the solution lies in the problem itself. We need to remember Allah, right? Let's take this from an Islamic perspective, from the Quranic perspective. Muslims are instructed to remember Allah, right, in the Holy Quran. Now, in order to do that, we have to do dhikr, right? That's remembrance of Allah, literally, right? And there's a step-by-step solution here that we're putting together. Remembering or memory requires attention, right? You have to be attentive in order to be able to grasp something so that you can recall later, right? If you're not you're a researcher at the Ahmadiyya Archive and Research Center yourself, right? And you write for Al-Hakam. You know that when you're reading through pages and pages of books, if you're not attentive, or if there's no noise in the background or chatter in the background or whatever, or your brain is tired and you're not fully attentive, you're not very likely to recall that information that you're consuming at that moment in time, right? And that's what I'm talking about here, that in order to improve your memory, or actually even just implement that cognitive ability, you need to be attentive. And attention itself requires presence, right? Again, we're talking about attention. We're talking about you sitting in the office, for example, and reading a book. Your attention is there. You need to be really present in those pages, in those words, in order to be able to be attentive in the first place, right? Once you're present, then you can be attentive. Once you're attentive, you can save it in your memory. That's how it works, right? And that essentially, that presence, that first step, that's the essence of dhikr, right? Of remembrance of Allah in the first place. Rumi actually wrote a really beautiful couplet about this. And I wrote this in the article as well, and I'll just quote it really quickly. He said that, "Now listen to the Prophet of mankind. No prayer is complete without a present mind." That's in the Masnavi now. And that's exactly what I'm referring to here. In this way, we can actually begin to cure this anxiety that we're having that's being caused due to our lack of presence. And that's actually what the Holy Quran also refers to, that it is in the remembrance of Allah that hearts can find comfort.
And I think you quite beautifully presented the theory behind the solution. How do you see this play out practically?
Practically, the solution is such that an effective way of healing our neural focusing ability, right? This is according to multiple neuroscience studies, right? And we'll add all of these studies, the links in our show notes, so that our viewers, our listeners, they can all access them and read further into it if they'd like. According to neuroscientists, the solution to this is to enter into meditative states, into meditation-like states, right? And for a Muslim, it's very easy to understand that. For us, that means salat, prayer, right? And the spiritual benefits aside, right? Let's look at just the psychological benefits. Salat acts as a cognitive intervention, right? It essentially balances our state of mind and our cognitive abilities. And this happens because there's an increase of hippocampal grey matter in our brain whilst we're in that practice, whilst we're in that state or stance. Now, other methods to employ can include reducing screen time. And I'm not talking about just reducing the screen time of your toddler or your kids, right? This applies to us as well, right? I mean, imagine, again, to our viewers, to our listeners, this is a challenge, right? Think about all of the Instagram reels or YouTube shorts you've gone through today, right? I'm pretty certain that you cannot recall the content of the majority of them. I'd be very surprised if you can even recall fully the content of one of those videos. And they're only 10, 15-second clips, right? And that screen time is not really helping us. More screen time and more content consumption isn't naturally resulting in more knowledge, right? Because that screen time, it's not attentive. It's not with a present state of mind, right? Our brains aren't designed to take in all of that information in such quick, succession. So that's one thing, by reducing screen time, we will reactivate our brain's natural memory building circuits. And another method is to constantly challenge the brain through analytical and memorizational practices. I mean, when I was a kid, the Nintendo DS came out, and then there was a really interesting game on there called Brain Training, if I'm not mistaken. And it was just a game of lots of different crosswords, Sudoku, puzzles, all of these kind of things, right? And it doesn't sound like a game when I put it that way, but it genuinely kept my brain sharp. And I do wish that I had carried on playing those kind of games more and more, because you can feel the difference, right? You're putting strain on your brain. It's like a muscle again. If you want to work out your chest at the gym, you do the bench press. For your brain, you need to be doing these kind of mental exercises, right? Analytical exercises. So the crux of the matter essentially is that attention truly matters. There's a famous English writer, Dr. Samuel Johnson, from the 18th century rather. He actually very aptly summarizes this, and I'll quote him. He says, "The true art of memory is the art of attention." So even over 200 years ago, people were aware of the fact that in order to remember something, right, it's about attention. He actually goes further to say that, all of this highlighting and taking notes and everything in your book whilst reading it, it's not that beneficial. If you truly want to remember what you've read, you really just need to, with full attention and focus and presence of mind, you need to be reading those words that you're reading, and then you'll be able to recall it. People can disagree with that. That's just his opinion. But the point is that with enough presence, with enough attention, our memory will thrive. So the fact is that forgetting a phone number in this way, it may seem insignificant, right? But with all of this science-backed research, which we'll have in the show notes, it's an ever-increasing danger, right, to our cognitive functions. And the solutions are available as well. I mean, perhaps just like a phone number, right, or a phone line, we need to take a step back and focus on that, establishing that very first and primary connection that human beings are supposed to have according to Islamic teachings, and that's a connection with Allah the Almighty. As He says in the Holy Quran, "Remember me and I will remember you." It's all about remembering.
Jazakallah, Daniel. This was very informative, and I believe I found my solution to certain particular issues in regards to digital amnesia. And if our viewers and anyone listening wants to learn more about this particular topic, I would recommend you to go on to alakam.org, where you will find an article on digital amnesia by Daniel Saib.